Nikocado Avocado is back and the tea is piping hot. So basically, Nick was going to go on an interview and fly all the way out to LA to be interviewed by H3's podcast, and Ethan Klein was ripping into him like he normally does on his channel, but I think Nick was getting offended by the things Ethan was saying, so basically he backed out last minute. Ethan also had to pay for Nick to fly out and accommodate Nick because Nick doesn't earn as much as Ethan, which is fair enough, and because apparently Ethan would be benefiting far more from the podcast interviewing Nick than vice versa the other way around. But basically Nick said in a vlog there was beef between him and Ethan, and there's a few reasons why he wouldn't be going on the podcast anymore. But instead of spilling the tea in his vlog, he spilt the tea on his Patreon, hoping that people would pay $20-something a month to sign up to his Patreon and hear the news. Obviously this pissed people off because people wanted to hear the tea. Ethan then mentioned in one of his recent videos how he felt trolled and used by Nick after Nick put his explanation as to why he wouldn't go on the podcast behind a $24 paywall. And basically a lot of people have been siding with Nick about this situation, which is crazy because this is a first, but people were defending his decision to not go on H3's podcast. Love Ethan, but the repetitive defibrillator comments and fat jokes in his last video were making me uncomfortable. So I couldn't really imagine being Nick. I was literally cringing. I know he has a bold sense of humour, but it felt slightly disrespectful to an upcoming guest. I think Ethan's last video kind of sealed the deal, even though he meant it as a joke. Obviously Nick didn't. Kind of a boundary that Ethan didn't respect, even though his intention wasn't to be rude/disrespectful. Not gonna lie, that podcast that was gonna happen would have been super intense if it did go through. But people are saying Nick would have cancelled on the podcast regardless because that's just the type of person he is. And although he did refer to the podcast as going in a lion's den, people are assuming that he just genuinely doesn't think Ethan Klein gets enough views for the podcast collab to be worth it. Ethan and Nick have been going off at each other for ages. They've been reacting to each other's reaction videos non-stop, and it's just so intense. Everyone's really sad because Nick cancelled on the podcast last minute, but like I said before, people are understanding because Ethan definitely went too far with the jokes and most likely hurt Nick's feelings. Now, although Nick was only telling his Patreon viewers the real tea on why he wouldn't be attending the podcast anymore, someone on Reddit actually took the time of day and reached into their back pocket to pay for Nick's Patreon and get the tea and break it down for all of us. The Reddit user said, "I paid for Nicocado's Patreon to find out why exactly he cancelled his upcoming interview with Ethan. Details inside. Unfortunately, I paid $24 for access to Nick's Patreon so I can learn about what happened. Here's a list of general details I got from the 21-minute video chronologically." Starts off the video by saying he sent an email to Dan stating he was cancelling the interview. Nick's no longer comfortable with the interview and that there's multiple reasons. Points out that all but one of his collabs with people have been super nice and respectful, but believes Ethan is only looking for a shit show and a Trisha Paytas replacement for the podcast. Problems with no boundaries, unprofessional, specifically about Ethan talking about financials and personal accommodations publicly on YouTube, and him making the joke up about the M&M's request and lying that Nick initiated the contract proposal. Says there's a limit to how much he can take in regards to Ethan's humour/degradation, and that his most recent H3 TV video was the deciding factor for the cancellation. Doesn't believe Ethan can make fun of his fatness and gayness and belittling him. Had issues with the podcast talking about his only day one, making a point how if he were a woman, they wouldn't be able to talk about him like that. States he did not plan to cancel, explaining he was thinking of going for 2 weeks and collab with friends before this. Goes on a small rant about viewership drop on his videos, about Ethan on his channel, claiming his audience doesn't seem to care for Ethan. He doesn't have much to gain from this, and that Ethan overstates the exposure he'll receive from the interview, claiming he would have seen an effect by now. He's not taking any money, and the contract proposal was only if the podcast cancelled due to an emergency after Nick arrives to California. Nick says part of it may be insecurities, doesn't feel comfortable putting himself in a situation where people will degrade him about his weight and work even if they're paying him. Talks about Olivia and how he only feels bad about cancelling because of her. Seems appreciative of her as a fan. Hopes her flight was refundable, but that he ultimately can't mix emotions with business. Has never had to get asked questions about his weight Goldberg, etc., and have to answer to it and to see them make fun of it. Kinda gets weird and a bit hard to understand here, but points out his lawsuits, although he points out how they're unjust, how there's drama with Ethan, and not to get him started with some of the comments he makes about society, pop culture, trendy stuff. Like, he's someone who thinks trigger warning is effective. He's one of those people who use trigger warnings before saying something. I just don't like him. Says that's all he'll say about that because he doesn't like to get political. This part's funny. Starts ranting about the guy Ethan podcasts with, mispronounces Hassan's name about 8 times, and how he annoys the F out of him. These people are so, annoys the F out of me. That's not Ethan's fault, but not sure what he's referring to exactly here, but I'll assume hopefully it's about politically far left entertainers. Moves on, acknowledges paywalling the explanation video was trashy, but that it's a trashy profession. Reiterates most points already listed and how it's not worth going to a lion's den, and how most of Ethan's stans don't like him. Not excited about this anymore, so you know what? Let's listen to my gut. No, you blew it. You blew it. The end. Although Ethan probably would have been very accommodating to Nick and tried his best to not make him uncomfortable in any way, similar to his treatment to Trisha on the Old Frenemies podcast, I think Nick's feelings were too hurt because of the jokes Ethan was making. They honestly didn't sound like jokes to a lot of people. It sounded like he was being full-on serious. So yeah, a lot of people were siding with Nick and could understand and respect why he decided to cancel the podcast interview. Ethan definitely missed the mark. However, under this Reddit thread were a lot of other people who are also paying for Nick's Patreon, and they had a lot to say about Nick cancelling the podcast last minute. Yeah, I read this post and thought maybe Ethan was taking it too far and this is fair, but this post doesn't point out how Nick focuses on the fact that the views were low on his videos for most of his Patreon vid. So after watching the Patreon video, in my opinion, is that Nick was going to go at first because he could get a free flight and a hotel, and he said he would do some other things in LA, like it's a holiday. Then I think it became too much effort. He couldn't be bothered and the views on his channel weren't doing so well, so he wanted to drop out, which is fine, but he didn't want to be blamed, so he tried to make Ethan the one to blame instead. In the whole Patreon video, he doesn't get animated and passionate until he mentions how the views were low. That's all he cares about. Fine, but don't slander Ethan, who is a comedian by the way, when you changed your mind. Ethan was legit so happy to have him. So that's definitely interesting, and it did seem obvious to many that Nick would probably cancel on the podcast as soon as everyone found out Nick was requesting a contract stating that even if he cancelled, he needed to be still paid in full. Basically, when that contract went through, Nick found all these reasons to find issues with what Ethan was saying about him, and this led Nick to having a decent reason to cancel. This is proof that Nick would never have had an honest interview with Ethan in the first place. Also, Ethan stating that he felt he got trolled, he's pretty spot on, especially by the sounds of that contract.
Okay, so it makes me a little suspicious that I got trolled or played or something, because why are you putting the explanation behind a $24 paywall?
But what are your guys' thoughts on all this? Let me know in the comments.